Hey everyone, Internet Pieces book reader here. Today I want to talk about 1984 Julia by Sandra Newman. First, let's get things straight. Retelling a story has been there for the longest time ever, with Greek mythology having numerous authors for the same setting and characters. We don't get Hercules' backstory where he became crazy and killed his own family and a ton of other famous Greek tragedy without retelling. Retelling a story in what the author imagined them to be when they read a story is old ritual. It's not something that is invented in modern era at all. Some of it was amazing. Circe and the Song of Achilles are some of the best modern example I can give, and my favorite book from last year is Demon Copperhead, which is a retelling of David Copperfield. And even in the movie, we have something like Ocean 11, which is a remake of the same title from the Rat Pack starring Frank Sinatra, which is a more forgettable experience. Not all of this retelling is good though. Some of them can be worse than the food I remade after I ate them, if you know what I mean. Like Mulan and most other Disney remake. Now this book, which is titled Just Julia, is a retelling of 1984. That's why the title on the cover looks like that. 1984 is a dystopian novel, or I guess I should say the dystopian novel for most people. It depicted an authoritarian government that had full control and monitor of the people living in it. The image of 1984 and Orwellian on the internet I think is a little bit tainted currently, since most of the people who like to create Orwellian on the internet are some of the cringiest people that stays on the internet for far too long on a day-to-day basis. Some of them are also clearly haven't ever read the book yet since they spend too much time on social media. But despite its image, it is still one of the best dystopian story ever told, where the author, George Orwell, is inspired a lot by his own experience living in Soviet under Stalin. A lot of the famous terms like double-think, unperson, and talk crime is a made-up word that is used in the world of 1984 that is coming from the newspeak they invented in order to reduce their people memories of old words. Orwellian itself you can say is newspeak, that's why people who use them usually have brain rot at its finest. Now in the novel Julia, we follow one of the major characters in the story, the lover of Winston Smith, the main character of 1984. 1984 is such a difficult word to reimagine, it's an imperfect word. That's why I'm interested to see if Julia is a good retelling, or does it follow many Disney remake and made a badly written one. The book starts with Julia having a few interactions with Simon, who worked at research that developed new speak to replace the old speak. Talking about Smith, the old misery they called him. A 40-year-old East guy who worked at record in charge of censorship who always looks miserable. Meanwhile, Julia, same as in 1984, works in fiction instead of Ministry of Truth. She's a mechanic that works in repairing the machine used to write fiction where they write propaganda plot for the people to read. A lot of 1984 is using fake storytelling, where most things are just there for no reason because the author says so. So it's a good opportunity to make a more detailed mechanism for the machines, which the author actually did quite well here. Since Oceania is not exactly trying to make anything new, they can just use machine to reproduce content that don't really add much to the story and storytelling, since they only need brain rot entertainment filled with propaganda for the masses. Once the machine print out a new story, it was sent to rewrite or censor the story further. She was idling when O'Brien from Law Department comes to the fiction floor, a popular guy who is rumored to have connections that can give people better work. So everyone immediately crowds to him, including Simon. Even Julia was thinking maybe she should check if he needed home repair to get a chance to be in his inner circle, but before she can put action to her talk, the whistle for the 2-minute hit starts blasting. A daily 2 minutes in Oceania dedicated to hating Emmanuel Goldstein, a friend of the Big Brother during the revolution that betrayed him and managed to escape. I think it's no secret that 1984 is a big metaphor for Soviet Union, with Vladimir Lenin represented as Big Brother and his partner Leon Trotsky is represented by Emmanuel Goldstein. During the rise of Joseph Stalin and his totalitarian government, he assassinated Trotsky and then he justified it by condemning him as the enemy of the people. There's a reason the novel is banned on its own original country for decades. The same happens in Emmanuel Goldstein in 1984, where every time a higher up at Oceania fell off a little bit, suddenly there's a new information about Emmanuel Goldstein and his group of brotherhood that did something. And the 2-minute hate is a chance to enable this rage bait on a daily basis as a whole. The book Julia at this point overdone a lot of its writing with additional details, including imaginary novels that fiction wrote. And for some reason, the football team of Oceania and the neighboring country East Asia, which instead of showing how bad the world is, it instead lessens the impact of how poor and unfed the people of Oceania are in general. The author even added some football chants for the fans, which in no way they have the energy to do those since the 2-minute hit will take all that energy away from the limited amount they have each day. Julia and her friends are also so free to have chocolates, cheese, and tons of alcohol, which makes the new Oceania in Julia feel like a richer country compared to the original Oceania in 1984. This also feels weirder later on in the book, since it was mentioned that chocolate are something that needs to be smuggled to Oceania to get them. They're supposed to be very rare and impossible to get. This is such a weird retelling of 1984. It's supposed to be from a woman's perspective, and 1984 is supposed to be about a world ruled by violence and fear of violence. And in such a world, it should be really easy to write how a woman should be so miserable, since even the men are miserable. But somehow, most of the time, they feel like they're having the time of their life in this horrible mess that is Oceania. I mean, even original Greek tragedy written in BC era did the horrible treatment of women better so far compared to this. Julia then also found an aborted child of another woman, which in what world does this happen? Definitely not on 1984, where you cannot even find places that feel safe enough to write a journal entry, let alone have sex or get the medicine or procedure needed to abort a child. It feels too convenient of a plot to happen in 1984. This event and the following conversation that Julia had with Vicky, the girl who had the abortion, feels like a long anti-abortion propaganda shoved in a retelling of 1984, which is like the worst choice of placement for propaganda since it stands out so much more since 1984 is a story against propaganda. I'm not confirming that the author did put those propaganda in there, it just reeks of it due to how it is written. It's possible that it's just bad writing. Not everything is this way with the book though, because it also tried to establish the Oceania world before the party got in power and made the world into the current dystopia. I think the author did a great job retracing the step on how the party becomes its current state, on how their rise to power goes unchecked to the point where even people who supported them at their start are starting to regret what they bring into the world. But at the same time, I think the author made a mistake when she chose to use Julia's point of view here instead of an older character, because she was so young and impressionable in the before time, and she was mostly busy falling in love with young pilots. It then went on for far too long until she became a lover with Winston, and then to the event that led to their capture by Ingsoc and the event that followed. 1984 itself doesn't have the most perfect storytelling. It is almost just bare-bone world building, but it did such a good job at making the atmosphere of that world so dreary and miserable, because it is a world that if you have an inkling of conscience, the world is not right. There's something majorly wrong with its state. And in this retelling, there's too much scene where Julia is too much of a fun girl just doing her own thing, which I don't see how that's possible in the world of 1984, because if it is possible, that atmosphere, that suffocation and panic-inducing feeling when you're reading 1984 is no longer there because you've made possible something that is not supposed to be possible. It's like you established the world have gravity, but then some people started floating. And also in the original 1984, you can feel that Big Brother is watching you is not just a random quote, but in a literal sense. That's where the paranoia and oppressiveness from 1984 come from. The point of retelling is not to tell the same story, but to add what already exists. Demon Copperhead is a perfect example of the most recent retelling that is actually good, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, Julia somehow feels like it took away from the original instead of adding something. The world of Julia feels like if a person who haven't experienced or read enough about oppression try to imagine what being oppressed feels through their own safety bubble. The world of 1984 is supposed to be a dystopian horror. It's an impossible world where it should be impossible to happen so unchecked. Even the Soviet that inspired the novel was gone. But that impossibility is also what made the fictionary world of 1984 so scary, since that impossibility was made real through George Orwell's writing. And that impossibility is missing because there's a lot of added detail that doesn't fit with the logic of the world of 1984 in Julia. Meanwhile, in the original 1984, while it is an exaggeration of reality, it's still grounded so much in George Orwell's experience living in Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, and most of the time that doesn't exist in this book. This feels like dystopian life. Like there's a difficulty slider that the author can change depending on what scene needs to be played. When the scene needs to be played out without any harsh repercussion, the slider goes to easy mode where it's less dystopian and more just regular old bad and corrupt government. But when it needed to, then the slider is slided back to dystopian, where everything will be met by the force that dystopian can have. And to make matters worse, Julia is also too long for no good reason. One of the reasons the original worked, It's because it's short and concise, so there's not that much time to linger on how some of the events in the book is possible at all. Meanwhile, in Julia, there's too much scene that feels random that should be cut out because they doesn't leave that much impact to the world building and to the characters. They're unnecessary and they just make the story feel longer, unfocused, and more boring than they could be. Some scenes are actually quite well written, but there's too much of this trashy scene to appreciate the good scene that felt like a rarity in this book, especially since every scene drags on forever. Those good scenes tend to only be good for the first few minutes. And because there's too much scenes forced into the story, in most of them, the Oceania people are forgetting to use any newspeak at all, which could be a death sentence in the logic of 1984. It's such a mess of storytelling with too much inconsistencies for its own good. At the end of the day, unfortunately, Julia as a retelling feels as unnecessary as other badly done retelling. I give this a 1.25. What do you think? Let me know if I missed anything, so leave your thoughts in the comment below and subscribe to the channel. That's about it. See ya.